So a neuron is generally a long, long cell. The neurons that innervate the tips of our toes basically start back here and they go all the way down to there. So we're talking about meters long, particularly if you're talking about a really big animal, where the neuron, the cell body will be in your spinal cord in many cases, and it will continue down as a single cell, single long thin cell, all the way to wherever it needs to go, which can be a long distance. But what these things look like, now there are differences. Some of the sensory neurons are a little bit different than this, but the basic way that a neuron looks is like this. We have these processes, which are basically just these plasma membrane covered extensions of the cell. And these are called, it almost looks like an insect. Just think of, what was that?
Dendrites?
Right, those are the dendrites.
Because it's your body. It's the fingers, and then your body is the axon, and then the terminal buttons are your toes.
You've learned this somewhere, haven't you? Keep that in mind. So yes, those are the dendrites. They're these. It almost even looks like that. That's why I was confused when you first started saying that. And it really does look like some kind of arachnid type thing, a mite or something. So that's poorly drawn. I'm sure I could do a better job than that. But basically, these are places where, in most neurons, input comes into the neuron. And so there will be, for example, an axon terminal, which is different from a dendrite mostly, that synapses with the dendrite. Now you can also have these synapses with the cell body, which is also poorly drawn up here. And what this is just extensions of the cell, that is the neuron, just little fingers, and it increases the surface area and really the field over which these neurons can interact with other things, such as other neurons, and this would be an example of interacting with other neurons. The signal, if it were coming in from here, would go down, just like we saw, we talked about the muscles. It would pass over the synapse, which we won't concentrate on greatly right here. And it can, although it doesn't necessarily, then continue on to the cell body and down the axon. So the cell body is quite a bit bigger than the axon, as the axon is thin, but it's long. And what the axon does, it's responsible for carrying what's known as an action potential down its length. Although it's more complicated than that. And then at the end of this, I probably should have drawn that in red rather than, I'll use purple. We have axon terminals. That's drawn a tiny bit. Ah! I blew it.
You won't tell anybody.
No, this is going to be posted on YouTube. Everybody will know. So we have axon terminals. Actually, let me do some labeling here. So this is our axon. And That's our axon terminal. Or terminals. Or axon buttons? Is that what you call them?
Terminal buttons.
Terminal buttons.
It's like your toes, because it keeps like buttons.
And basically what happens is just as the cell at this end, the neuron at that end, can take in multiple inputs from different other cells, other neurons, in fact can take in inputs from potentially thousands of other neurons. At this end, the neuron is capable of synapsing also with multiple other cells, multiple other neurons. So you can have lots of information coming in, and then lots of information going out, lots of information coming in from different places, and then you have the information flowing out to different places. And at this end, we can have, again, dendrites. Maybe I should draw this closer like that. No, that's terrible. Nobody will know. Let's get real here. There we go. That's a dendrite associated with another neuron. And again, that would be a synapse, and the information would flow along to here. Now, the interesting thing is that the information that comes in to the neuron is information that does not necessarily lead to the formation of an action potential. If every synapse between neurons, if every time you had neurotransmitters released into those synapses, you had the firing of the downstream neuron, which is essentially what you see in neuromuscular junctions. In a neuromuscular junction, the motor neuron moves along to the neuromuscular junction, and then you have the initiation of the muscle contraction all the time. If that happened with neurons, then every time this thing released neurotransmitter, this thing therefore generated an action potential, which then went to the next neuron or neurons and generated an action potential, then our nervous system would be pretty boring. And that would be a lot like what you see with reflex arcs. I mean, you can get fairly sophisticated behavior out of a reflex arc, but it's nowhere near as sophisticated as the kind of thinking that our brains are capable of, and presumably the brains of other animals are capable of. And the reason why we can do much more sophisticated things than simply, for example, withdrawing our hand from a hot stove when we feel it, a little bit of burning, is because these connections between the neurons don't necessarily lead to action potentials. Just because this neuron is turned on and is supplying an action potential that then leads to release of neurotransmitter and then does something at this end doesn't mean that this neuron also is going to be turned on. And instead what you have this is another neuron. And that's another neuron. You have multiple neurons that are synapsing with some other neuron. And these multiple neurons supply what's known as a depolarization, or they cause a depolarization of the postsynaptic neurons. So these presynaptic neurons can depolarize the postsynaptic neuron. Or alternatively, the presynaptic neurons can inhibit the depolarization of the postsynaptic neuron. And so what you have is not binary information that is being moved from one neuron to another neuron. In other words, just because this is on doesn't mean that's on. Instead, you have a much more subtle thing going on where each neuron that is presynaptic is causing some kind of change in the postsynaptic neuron but that change that's being caused may or may not be sufficient to cause this neuron to carry a signal down to whatever's downstream from it. So these different presynaptic neurons might together increase the amount of information they're causing, which is saying the same thing as causing a greater amount of depolarization, or alternatively, maybe inhibiting that depolarization. And it's only once the level of depolarization, the extent of the signal that's being received is great enough that suddenly the action potential is tripped. It's called a threshold potential. You have to cause enough changes in the membrane here that suddenly this neuron gets turned on and it propagates a signal down to this end. So instead of just something comes along and causes something to happen, which is, I mean, when I was learning about how neurons work, that's how we were taught. And I was like, how could you possibly go from something like that and build it up to something as sophisticated as our brain? And the answer is you just can't. But when you've got these signals that aren't just on or off, but instead supply a little bit of information where you're not necessarily going to get an action potential unless you have multiple neurons simultaneously supplying the right amount of signal innervation, of, I guess, depolarization to actually get an action potential. So what we have are a bunch of little mini computers that are inside of our bodies that are individual neurons that gather in information from all sorts of different places, and depending upon what kind of connections there are between these other places in that cell, the combinations of information that is taken in may or may not cause this neuron to fire, thereby supplying information to the next neuron, and so on and so forth. And we have tens of billions of neurons in our brains, and we've got thousands of connections between the individual neurons, and at some point those numbers become great enough that we can have a huge amount of sophistication, which is our brain. But at the same time, we've got a lot of neural networks that are very simple, that consist of maybe just one interneuron, or maybe just a little more than one. Where instead of having this subtlety, we have much less subtlety, and this allows our bodies to function essentially on automatic pilot. When you are walking, I mean, we think of walking as a very simple task, but really walking is almost falling, followed by almost falling, followed by almost falling, followed by almost falling. You don't think about that. You don't think about that you're on the precipice every time you take a step, but you really are. And the reason you don't fall over is because we have all of these reflexes in our body that anytime something happens, I mean, when I start tilting that way, I immediately do that. Very simple neural networks that make sure that our bodies are able to do these simple tasks on automatic pilot, so at the same time, our brains don't have to deal with that, and therefore they can deal with more sophisticated tasks. When they first started trying to make complicated robots, they tried to pass all of the behavior of the robots through the equivalent of the brain of the robot. So the robot had to think about things. So as the robot was doing its, moving, scurrying about, maybe on legs, maybe on wheels, whatever, it had to actually use the same processing power that it needed to use for higher level ideas, such as, where should I go, as opposed to how do I get there. Behaviorally, how do I walk or drive there. And as a consequence, it was not very sophisticated behaviorally, because it had to use up a lot of processing power in order to do the simple things, such as walking or moving about. And then they realized, wait a minute, that's not how, and at the time they were using insects as an example, that's not how insects work. Insects have these higher level sophisticated behaviors, but at the lower level, they've got all of these reflexes. They've got all these little tiny circuits that are very simple that make sure that the insect, as it's walking, does this. As opposed to, I've got to think about lifting my leg and moving my leg forward and putting my leg down, and aha, that leg is down, therefore I've got to think about lifting this leg. And so they don't think about that. They have very simple neural networks that allow them to do that. And then they also have, in their central nervous system, these more sophisticated networks that allow them to thereby display more sophisticated, higher level behaviors. So we've got this input of information, could be sensory neurons, could be neurons inside of our brain, and we don't have just this neuron turns that neuron on, but instead we have something known as summation. You have a bunch of different neurons, a bunch of different inputs, and these different inputs basically are literally summed. So each one adds a little bit of a level of a signal, and if the signal gets high enough to what's known as the threshold potential, then suddenly, pow, you have an action potential that carries on information to the next neuron. Now, it's more complicated than that, of course. And one of the additional complications is this thing called myelination. I'm deciding on a color here. We'll use that one. So these axons are actually wrapped. That's poorly drawn. They're wrapped in insulation. And the insulation consists of cells that supply myelin. Myelin? I certainly hope that's spelled correctly. Which is a lipid, which is something that is an electrical insulator. So the actual movement, although we haven't really talked about what it is, of the information from one end of the axon to the other occurs via electrical-like signals. They involve ions that have electrical charges. And by having insulation around this wire, the movement of these signals is much more efficient, and it also is much faster. And it also has less potential for going haywire because we have the insulation. Yeah?
Why do they not connect?
We're getting to that.
Okay.
And in fact, they don't connect. I'm purposefully drawing it like that. So this together is called a myelin sheath. And in the peripheral nervous system, the myelin sheath is associated with something called Schwann cells. And in the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, instead it's oligodendrocytes. Dendrocytes. And what they do is they wrap around the axon, and they provide multiple layers of this myelin, and that provides a great deal of insulation that essentially causes a large span of the axon to not depolarize. So you only get this depolarization going on in these little nodes between the myelin that are called nodes of, I'm going to pronounce it as though it were French, I'm assuming it is. That's an R. Ranvier. Or Ranvier if you want. And the space that's covered up by, or the part of the axon that's covered up by the myelin, are called internodes. And so what happens is you have signal passing down the axon, and because of this insulation, the signal is protected, but also the signal can move faster, and the signal is more efficient in its movement in terms of energy usage. And this is because you actually have a jumping of the signal, I'm running out of space here, from node of Ranvier, to node, to node, to node, to node, and so on. And that's called actually saltatory conduction of the nerve impulse, of the action potential. And underneath the myelin, you don't have the signal. Instead, it's inside the cell. Depolarization, as it's called, that occurs here causes depolarization here, which in turn causes depolarization there. And the speed with which that signal can move from there to there is actually faster than the signal can propagate along the surface of the cell. all of the signal we were talking about going on here is all propagating along the surface of the cells. All of this signal, the depolarization, is actually occurring in association with the plasma membrane of the cell. But when you have an axon that's myelinated, instead this saltatory conduction of the nerve impulse, you're having going boom, and then 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 boom. When you have a depolarization event, you have to repolarize things. That takes energy and time. And by having just a small amount of the axon having to go through the depolarization event, you save energy and you save time, plus the whole thing conducts much faster. So you have this summation of inputs into the dendrite, of the dendrites as well as the cell body. Cell body, I should actually explicitly draw that, cell body. It's also known as soma, and the location of the cell body differs depending upon the type of neuron you have. And I also should write up here that what we're looking at are neurons, or a neuron, and another name for neuron is nerve cell. But none of these are the same thing as nerves. A nerve instead is a bundle of axons that are all sheathed together. They're myelinated, but then they're sheathed further in connective tissue. And the individual nerves are what follow different pathways around our bodies, and then they have neurons that branch off from those nerves. And their axons go to specific locations. But the gathering together of essentially the middle part of the neurons, the axons, are what we call nerves. And the nerves are made up of parts of neurons, a bunch of different neurons that are associated with one another. So this is a neuron. So we have this input of information at the dendrite end, at the cell body end. We have, for example, neurons that have synapsed with the dendrites or the cell body. Those neurons at those synapses don't necessarily supply enough what is known as depolarization to cause an action potential to occur. But if you have enough neurons together that are firing simultaneously, they're stimulating this neuron simultaneously, such that you get sufficient depolarization, that leads to what's known as a threshold, or results in a threshold potential, which then turns into an action potential, and you have movement of the signal. This signal goes down the axons. It's a little bit different in certain kinds of neurons, but most neurons, it starts at this end and it goes down the axon in that direction. And you have movement down the axon, a wave of depolarization, and this depolarization is more efficient and goes more quickly if you've got this myelin insulation on the axons. And in fact, in multiple sclerosis, that is a disease of a degeneration of the myelin, which causes a loss of coordinated activity because your neurons are not working as effectively and they're not able to coordinate with each other as well because, in fact, the signal can't move down the axon as effectively. And then we get to this end, and we've got the axon branching off in these short branches with which synapse with other cells, other neurons, or in fact with muscle cells. And there are synapses or neuromuscular junctions. And in the muscle cells, you do get this either on or off. If you have a synapse that is releasing neurotransmitter, the muscle reacts. But if you're interacting with other neurons, you get the same kind of thing at this end as you get at this end. You get these qualitative effects where you are supplying some depolarization, but not necessarily enough for the downstream or the postsynaptic neuron to actually have an action potential and therefore being able to have whatever effect it has once its signal has gone down its axon. So it's a very, very sophisticated thing. I didn't realize at all how it could even be sophisticated until I understood this concept of summation. And really, summation maybe not explains it all, but it goes a long way towards providing an idea as to how it's possible for brains to be as sophisticated as they are. It's much more than just, I know you're just dying there to ask something. It's much more sophisticated the way we put together our own computers, where we just have a 1 or a 0. It's like you have a whole gray area in there, and therefore it has much on a per circuit level, it has much higher potential for sophistication. Yes?
What exactly is action potential?
Well, I've been carefully avoiding that.
Okay.
And I can try to I can erase and make an attempt at showing what that is, or I can show it on the screen. How are we doing on